Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the truth that comes down from Jesus and the apostles over 2,000 years. We want to help you to know your faith, love your faith, live your faith, and be inspired by it. And sometimes we preach the hard truth, even when it's not convenient and even when it's difficult. And today we're going to be talking about IVF, in vitro fertilization, because a lot of people have questions about this. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it wrong? Is it sinful? Is it like a mortal sin? A lot of Catholics, some Catholics have even participated in it, maybe unknowingly, and they have questions about it. So we are going to be covering this topic today. And because it's important, I think the Pope came out recently and said some comments that kind of shocked the whole world. So, if you're living for the world and you're living for Christ, sometimes they're two different things, and you have to decide which side you want to be on. And to join us today, we have a wonderful person who is fluent in all of these topics on morality and bioethics. And her name is Samantha Stevenson. And if you don't know her, she is the host of a Brave New Us podcast, now on YouTube. Check it out. And the author of Reclaiming Motherhood from a Culture Gone Mad. Oh, yes. That's why I just made this shirt. Our New Catholic Truth shirt is Truth in an Age of Confusion, Oxygen in a Toxic Culture. It's literally, you can't say anything more true than that. She is a Paul Ramsey Fellow at the Center of Bioethics and Culture and holds a master's degree in theology and bioethics. She's written a ton. She's spoken a ton. If you want to get in touch with her, we will link her information in the description section below. But Samantha, I want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it's such a joy to have you. I know you're so knowledgeable on these things. And when we follow God's laws and we follow God's commands, it makes sense. It brings us peace. It brings us joy, brings us good in our life. And when we don't, the opposite tends to happen. And we have this rift where we don't always know what's true because the world tells us one thing and the church has been amazingly bad at informing us on a wide I guess, they're good at it. They'll put it in documents. They'll teach the truth, but they're really bad in getting it out there to every one of us, so we know what the church teaches. So a lot of people have questions on this topic of in vitro fertilization. And when they hear it's really against God or it's really bad or something like that, they're like, wait, what? Why? And they naturally have questions. So maybe you could just start out by explaining what it is and maybe, the problems with it, that sort of thing, however you want to go.
Yeah. I think that really can surprise people because people think, the church is pro-life. The church must be pro-baby. The church must want people to have as many babies as possible, right? Which of course isn't true. Obviously, the church has always urged people to practice responsible parenthood. When it comes to IVF, the idea or the thing that people feel is I want to have a child, and that's such a good desire, and that is a good desire. But when we look at methods of conception, not every method of conception is a good method of conception. And that's not to say that every child conceived, that every soul isn't created in the image and likeness of God with innate, invaluable dignity. Every child conceived has that dignity. But we can obviously look at certain methods of conception and say, well, that we can denounce as a bad method of conception. And the most egregious example of that, of course, is rape, right? So we could look at that and say that child that's conceived of rape is a beautiful gift from God, but the method by which that child was conceived is not in accord with God's plan for sexuality and for marriage and for the dignity of any human person. And so likewise, when we look at IVF, we can ask, is this method a good method of conception? And by good, we don't mean, does it work? Is it effective? Which it's not by any means the most effective way of solving infertility. And we can talk about that medically speaking. But is this in accord with God's plan for marriage and for family? And so we look at IVF, it actually violates the dignity of the child, the rights of the child. It violates what's good for the woman, her health, and it violates the goods of marriage. And so we can break it down. We can take those things one by one if you want today.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So if you want to think about how does it violate the rights of the child? Like, that's a pretty strong statement to make. So the rights of the child are to be, and this is from a document, Dona Vitae in 1987. And like you said, some people just aren't aware that that the church has been teaching these things for so long. That's older than I am. So if you want to think about that, you're right. The church does have maybe a little bit of a PR problem, and so hopefully, you and I can work on spreading that message today. But if you want to look at it, it says that a child has a right to be conceived, carried, and brought up in marriage by both of his natural parents. Now we can look at society and say, well, gosh, we're violating a lot of those rights today then with various practices, and we could talk about those too. But ultimately, when we're looking at something like IVF versus adoption, even in adoption, where a child is raised by somebody who's not their natural parents or is, not conceived, carried, and along the same trajectory, well, adoption and IVF both create this primal wound, and children of both can tell us that the wounds that they have and the pain that they go through is very real suffering. And the difference between something like adoption and IVF is, well, an adoption makes the best of an already imperfect situation. In adoption, children are given families who wouldn't otherwise have them. That primal wound already exists, and adoption is a solution to the primal wound of the child. Adoption is not a method for parents to obtain their desire of having a child. Although that's a good desire, and it's good that they have that, and it leads them to solve the problem for the child. In IVF, the intended parents, participate in the creation of that primal wound for their child. So that is one of the problems with egg donation surrogacy that the Pope is talking about. Why is he denouncing it as deplorable? Because that's not something that we want to be doing to our children. That's not the way we want to start out our parental relationship with surrogacy, the exploitation of women, and the commodification of children. So that's another problem, is that rather than being received as a fruit of procreation, of the love of two people coming together in marriage, that's supposed to be like a visible sign of God's love for the church. It's supposed to be a visible sign of the love of the Trinity coming together, the Father and the Son, and their love proceeds into the person of the Holy Spirit, and a husband and a wife, and their love proceeds into the very real person of their child. And it's amazing. It's beautiful. The church has some amazing, John Paul II has some amazing, beautiful work on the meaning of human sexuality, the meaning of the body, and the theology of the body. So that's what the ideal, that's the best possible way that that's supposed to come about. Well, what IVF does is it takes procreation out of that beautiful framework and puts it in a laboratory. It takes the child's conception out of the unity of love that it's meant to be, and it makes the child a product to be bought and sold. It makes the child a product of a creation of science, which is not to say that God doesn't also participate. Obviously, he ensouls that child, and again, that child has inalienable dignity. But what it does is it makes that so much less than what it's supposed to be. And if we look at the etymology of the word sin, sin comes from, it's an archery term, and it's about missing the mark. And so what happens in IVF is we're really missing the mark, and we're making children. Having children is supposed to be a generative, self-giving act. The husband and the wife give of themselves to each other. And this is the fruit of that giving, that fruit of that love, that giving and receiving that happens. What IVF does is says, I have a desire for something, and I can pay money to someone to obtain that something, and that something is a child. And so what's being done is that the child is commodified, being bought and sold.
It's so dehumanizing,
It is.
especially the way you put that and you phrase it, it's terrible. But it also sounds like it would be, in the realm of mortal sin. It sounds like it is a grave sin, like a grave misuse of our sexuality on many different levels.
It absolutely is grave matter. Now, whether we would call it grave sin, I think, or mortal
Right.
sin, that depends on a variety of
Our
factors. We
knowledge
could
of
break
it.
that down. But yeah, I think knowledge and freedom of the will. And I think if we are going to give the most compassionate interpretation of freedom of the will here, it's a very, very painful thing to struggle with infertility, especially when there's a very good desire that appears to be off limits or taken away. And that's the earliest lie that we receive from the deceiver. Our parents, Adam and Eve, they were told God wants to, in the garden, they're told God wants to withhold something good from you. And so that's a very easy lie for us to buy into. We're really easily deceived by thinking that God is
100%.
not good, especially in this day and age where people have so many primal wounds from their own parental relationships. It can be really easy to doubt God's goodness, and that if he's withholding something from you, it's
And
easy
same
to
thing with
think.
Abraham as well. Abraham was told that he was gonna have a child, but he didn't have it in his time frame, and so he got
Hmm.
eager and had relations with his servant to try to bring about a child. He's like, "Well, maybe this is the way it's gonna come," and God's like, "You didn't trust me. You tried to
Yeah.
take matters into your own hands," and what was the penalty for that? Sexual deviancy?
Mm.
Circumcision. Like, for every male after that, it's like, but God's like, "Trust me, I'm going to give you the child." And I like what you said at the beginning of the show,
Mm.
that there's much better, healthier, safer, more effective
Mm.
methods for conceiving children than IVF that are in line with the church, and many people don't know about them, which is why they go to this. So maybe we can have a whole show on that. We do have one show so far if anyone wants to check it out on our Catholic Truth Family YouTube channel. It's our alternate channel.
Mm.
Or maybe, well, this is going to be put up on both of them, but and it's on infertility. And one of my
Mm.
old good friends who has struggled with it, and she's writing a book on it. But I also know many, many, many Catholics who have gone to the same doctor that my wife and I did, and they have all conceived the same way we have, because these NFP doctors are miracle workers and can work miracles
Yeah.
with most people. So, praise God for that. But if you're interested in that, let us know, leave a comment, and maybe we'll have a whole show on that in the future, and
Yeah.
bring Samantha back to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. Going back to what you said before, though, about the sinfulness of the act, I think we can look at IVF, look at a couple of things that maybe will bring to light why this would be considered such grave matter just in the process of IVF. So, aside from looking at the theological effects on marriage, things like that, there are over 1 million souls on ice in this country alone as products
Whoa,
of that are have been discarded as a result of
whoa,
IVF. So IVF is very expensive. It's about $12,000 a cycle, and anybody who's tried to conceive anyway, even if you don't struggle with infertility, it takes more than one cycle usually to get pregnant. Well, so you have to add the cost of those cycles. So you want to create, if you are looking at this from an economic standpoint, if you're a big fertility and your clinic is looking at this, you want to create as many viable embryos as possible. And you can't implant all of those embryos into a woman at one time. They usually implant, maybe four, maybe five. What if 4 or 5 take? That's very rare. But it's not so rare that 3 or 2 take, and then they practice what's called selective reduction, and that's just code for abortion. Which one of these, you've tried so hard to have these babies, you've created them in the lab, you paid a lot of money, but there's too many to give the best possible chance of a live birth. So then we get to decide which one of these embryos that's implanted that you're now pregnant with, and which one do we discard, which one do we eliminate via abortion. So obviously that's grave matter there. And
yeah,
then that's even, so that's the fate, even if they make it to being implanted, but they also use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is a fancy way of saying that they look at the genetics of the embryos that they've created and see which ones do we discard because they're not good enough. So which ones are we going to set aside because of their sex? Which ones are we going to thaw and allow to die because they don't have the genetics that we want? They might have, any number
mm,
of genetic issues. And on the flip side of that, there are also there have been some very rare cases where people have considered those genetic defects to be desirable. And so they're looking to implant, say, a deaf couple is looking to implant a deaf child so that the child would be genetically similar to them. And that's debated amongst ethicists whether or not that falls within the realm of something that would be an ethical choice. There have been cases where women wanted to implant embryos with Down syndrome. And so ethicists are still debating whether or not that's acceptable. What I think we can all say is not acceptable is eliminating them from the pool of conception just based on their genetics.
Wow, that's crazy. I didn't know a lot of that information, so thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, well, and so then back to these million souls that are waiting. Once a family, hopefully conceives or sadly realizes that this is not going to happen, because these procedures really are only effective, according to CDC data, it's in the maybe 25%, I want to say. I've seen as high as 30 in some studies. I've seen as low as 7%, especially for older women.
Wow.
But
So it might not even work.
Right.
Chances are it won't work by the sounds of it.
Chances are it won't work. And then some studies show that couples who have been through IVF, there's a 20% chance that they will conceive naturally after their use of IVF. And so whether there's a causal relationship there, some people say, well, IVF opened up the woman's body to be more receptive or something like that. Or no, there was just, God had plans and he was saying, wait, and it didn't work out that way.
Or even if it is true, it doesn't make it a good thing, going back to what you say, the causality doesn't necessarily make something good. I mean, we can seek to be healed, but that doesn't mean we go to a witch doctor or voodoo to try to find healing, because those would be really bad methods to go about that.
Right. Bad, dangerous for your soul, and ineffective.
Yes.
But then the question, though, for these couples, especially say you are a Catholic couple and you did experience infertility. And I had a woman on our podcast. She's a doctor and she has 3 children by IVF. And couples like that, when they later come around and they understand the truth of what was at stake, then they realize, oh my goodness, I have however many embryos, however many children. What am I going to do? What do I do with these embryos who are on ice? What do we do with these million embryos that are on ice, that are essentially abandoned because the parents don't wish to continue to grow their family, or don't wish to continue to pay for these cycles, or can't continue to pay for these cycles. And the church has said this is actually a situation of injustice that has no solution, because the cooperation with IVF is morally problematic. But these souls, the only thing that you can do is you could thaw them, try to give them a peaceful passing. You could try to freeze them indefinitely, but that at some point you are going to die, and somebody has to continue to pay for the energy and the resources of keeping them in cryostasis. And then that's another question in of itself, is just the custody battles that happen. And there's also something that's called either embryo donation or embryo adoption, depending on how pro-life your view is of that embryo, what you want to call it. And there are some Christian churches that advocate for, yes, if the parents are done, somebody else can adopt. And so the oldest embryo to date that's been adopted and born that I'm aware of is about 30 years. So I think that the woman and the woman who's the mother of her adopted embryo was born the same year that her daughter was conceived. So those are just some
crazy.
Of the crazy
I'm beginning to
things
see why the Pope said that it's abhorrent in other choice words he used. And I can also see how and why the child and marriage in general is dehumanized in not a good way. It's not a good thing. But you also spoke about the woman. Maybe we can move on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that this is a predatory practice towards women. This is exploitative of women's very good desire for children, and it's exploitative of the pain that they experience. So essentially, the effectiveness levels that are being put out by the CDC that I just described to you, 25%. If there was a drug on the market, or a drug being proposed for the market that had that rate of effectiveness, it wouldn't even be a question. That's not something that we would approve. But we can experience, and it was even lower, 30 years ago when it was first being pursued, the effectiveness rate was very low. But we have all of these women who are willing to submit themselves to become test subjects because they so desperately want a child. And so the fertility industry takes advantage of that. They say, yeah, we can charge them a large sums of money to become our willing experimental patients. And so I think that is that's one issue. We also have the fact that we don't really know the long-term effects of some of these procedures, especially with something like egg donation. Egg donation, the extraction, you are pumped full of hormones. And we do know that there are very serious risks to things like you can die from ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which is the goal. The goal of egg donation. You want to get as many eggs out of a woman's body as possible, and this is how they're obtained for, even if you're going to be doing IVF with your own eggs. Your body's pumped full of these hormones so they can get, hopefully they want to get like 30 eggs. How many eggs does a woman's body release normally in a cycle? 1, maybe 2 if she's having twins. Sometimes that happens. But to get 30 or even 15, I mean, your abdomen swells up, you look pregnant, and you can experience some really dangerous side effects from that. And so those we know, but there haven't been any long-term longitudinal studies to see what happens to these women 30 years. Do they have higher risks of cancer? We know that can happen sometimes when we're pumping our bodies full of hormones. Do they have higher risks of these other complications? And so anecdotally, we know that absolutely, yes, this is a risk. You can look at the CBC's documentaries. They have some great ones. One of them is called Exploitation. Breeders is about surrogacy. So you can listen to the stories of women who have gone through these procedures and then later experienced some, or even in the midst of it, experienced some pretty serious side effects. I said, oh my goodness, what have I done? And long term, what will that do to me? And so we know anecdotally there are risks, but nobody's doing the research,
But it doesn't
because why
sound
would you?
like just not only just risks and not only monumentally expensive, which is
Mm,
crazy,
mhm.
but I could see how they're being taken advantage of, but it almost seems like they're just being used as incubators as well. They're not even being seen as like full humans. They're just being used in a sense.
Well, that absolutely, with surrogacy, that is the case. I mean, by and large, these contracts always favor the buyers. That's where the money is. And the woman who's just acting as a surrogate, whose womb is being rented, is systematically, routinely dehumanized. So women are written out of contracts. Their existence is written. It's not put on birth certificates many times. It depends on the contract, but she's written out of existence there. Surrogates have been forced into abortions. That happened, I think, most recently with Brittany Pearson, who was she was forced to undergo abortion when she was a surrogate for this gay couple
Wow.
who decided that they did not want a child born early at 34 weeks, which is not really, even that early. They didn't want the possible negative effects of a child born early so that she could undergo cancer treatments. And she was willing to push it out and to delay the birth until it would be healthy for the kids. But the intended so-called fathers were not willing to allow to care for a child who might be compromised in that way. And being born at 34 weeks, that's a risk of many, like that's just a normal pregnancy risk. But no, they insisted that she was forced to abort. Then there are, the other options that happen with surrogacy. So the flip side of that is parents break up, the intended parents break up and decide, you know what, we don't want this baby anymore. Surrogates have been left just completely abandoned, footing the bill. Sometimes the surrogates end up with the baby because the baby does have Down syndrome or something like that, and they refuse to abort, and they're able to do that. So there's all kinds of blunders, but the women really are reduced to their biological function and treated as a machine almost more than a
Really
person.
sad, actually.
Mhm.
A lot of
It
this is
is.
really sad, and most
It
of this,
is.
most people don't know. Most of this, I don't know. Like, I'm not
Mm.
big up on
Mhm.
IVF. I know about it. I know the basics, but, like, I don't know a lot of the detailed aspects of it.
Yeah, it's
So,
pretty harrowing sometimes, the things that can
yeah,
happen as a result.
so we have the child, we have the
Mm.
woman being
Mhm.
dehumanized, and many problems with that. I'm sure many more you could speak on for an hour. What was
Yeah,
the third
I
part?
could. And so violating the goods of marriage. So we have the understanding as Catholics that that sexual union within marriage is for the purposes of unity and for procreation. And anytime we separate those, we run into trouble. So it renders the act less than what it's supposed to be. And what do we talk about? Sin is missing the mark. So we miss the mark uh, on sexuality when we take it outside of marriage, whether that's premarital sex, whether that's adultery. When we miss the mark on or and we miss the mark when we separate procreative and unitive. So that is contraception, and on the flip side, that's IVF. So when we try to have sex without conception, that's contraception. We're separating the procreative out of the act. Well, when we try to procreate without the sexual unitive aspect, that's the flip side of the coin. That's IVF. So when you are reproducing with, say you're doing it the most straightforward way that you can do it. You're using your husband's sperm, which has to be obtained in ways that are by and large illicit, according to the church's teaching, and you're using the egg of the wife. You're still taking it and ripping it away from the process that it's supposed to come about. And you're inviting a third party, or sometimes more than a third party, into that process by asking the doctor to come into that intimacy of your marriage with you. So there's problems with that. We also have problems when, say, you're reproducing with sperm or eggs that are not belonging to the husband or wife. So what we have there is what donum vitae implies is a kind of reproductive infidelity. And that's a little bit more difficult for us to grasp because, well, for the majority of human history, you couldn't have a child with somebody else's biological material without also having sexual infidelity. And we understand, I think intuitively, why that is a problem for marriage. Um, but it's a little bit more difficult to grasp the pain and the difficulty in marriage when somebody goes outside of the marriage to reproduce. So, what we are supposed to be imaging as husband and wife to each other in marriage is total, absolute acceptance of the other person in everything. So that means accepting their fertility when we choose to come together in marriage and not using contraception, but that also means accepting and loving them in their infertility. And in fact, when we talk about this morally speaking within the church, we want to talk about the couple as being fertile or infertile. The couple is experiencing infertility. When we isolate one or the other spouse as the problem, that is very divisive. And it takes this procreative process that's supposed to be unitive, it takes that and it divides the couple. And so when one spouse goes ahead, even with the consent and the desire, the other person's like, I don't want to hold you back from having your dream of a child. Already that's separating
Oh,
the couple. And so and I think one of the poignant examples that I will never forget of somebody who's expressed this pain. She's not, I don't believe she's Catholic. I don't even know if she's Christian, but actress Gabrielle Union talked about what it was like to watch her husband procreate. And she's breaking down in tears over seeing this surrogacy ultrasound. And everybody thinks, like, oh, she's just so awed by the beauty of this life. And she's going to have a baby. It's related to her husband. She said, that's not why I was crying. What she was experiencing was seeing that her husband could reproduce, not procreate, so easily with somebody else. She said it felt like her soul was fine dust scattered in the wind.
like number one, she was broken. She didn't work right, but someone else did. So she's better
Mhm.
than me. Number two, that's not even my baby in some
Yeah.
sense. Like I could see many problems occurring with that would lead to really just breaking down.
Yeah. And so one of the tragic
Like,
consequences
sorry,
we
sorry, sorry,
see.
sorry. Just like the Abraham story I brought up earlier. What happened right after
Mm,
that?
Mhm.
Sarah got incredibly angry at the maidservant that she could have a kid, and she started abusing her and hurting her because she kind of had that same thing. I can't have a baby, but she did, and so easily. And so the
Right.
maid servant ended up running away.
Right, yeah, and that's that even though, the biological processes, that's not maybe a scientific way, but that really was a kind
Similarity,
of
yeah.
no, but the pain that she's expressing there, it wasn't she knew that her husband was going to be sexually unfaithful, but the pain that she's experiencing there is, this is the pain that's coming as a result of my husband getting the desire of his heart, a child, the desire of my heart, a child, but it's not my child, it's with somebody else. And so that pain there is, I
Mm.
think, something that we don't hear a lot about because when when that occurs, I mean, it's very rare. Like this is a new development in human history uh, to try to reproduce this way. But then how are you supposed to be honest with people about, whoa, this is really painful. Like this thing that I paid a lot of money for and this thing I invested so much of my health and my time and my life in, but this is really painful, even though, but then that makes you sound like I wouldn't say it if it had been me. I would sound so ungrateful, even if that's the reality. And I think that is the reality because if we look at the stats on divorce after IVF, especially when it ends up not coming to the fruition, not coming to the goal that they want, it's something like 3 times higher than couples who do not use IVF. And we already have a huge high divorce rate. And then if we do end up looking at natural family planning and NAPRO technology, which we talked about earlier, the divorce rate for couples who use natural family planning is something like 3%. So much, much lower than even the standard. So I think those are some of the things that we need to get the word out about this, just
Yes,
like you said.
amen. And I want to put a huge exclamation point after that, about 2 to 3% abortion, divorce rate for people
Mm,
who practice NFP, natural family planning, and doing it God's way. The
yeah.
way He designed a woman's body to work.
Mhm.
For life and for her, for health, for everything. And I would love to have a whole show on that in the future because I think that's important because people don't
Yeah.
realize. Same thing with contraception. People just don't realize that it's like a huge grave sin, like one of the biggest
Mm,
sins. And no one's ever told them that. Or maybe they kind of heard that, but they don't know why.
mhm.
And I think they don't just sin aside. I mean, I grew up, everything's a sin. You're bad if you sin,
Yeah.
like it's just could be just negative if you point to everything as sin, but they don't know how it can hurt you as a person. They
Mhm.
can hurt your marriage. It can hurt your children. It can hurt every part of aspect of your marriage. And many women do know that they've come to see that. But there's a lot of other aspects that I think need to be discussed, including the really shady multi-billion-dollar culture behind it all.
Mm,
Experimenting on women in other countries, killing them, different like really bad things.
right.
Um, but maybe we'll talk about that in another show. And I just want to
Yeah.
end by, kind of putting the word out there to any women. Maybe you have done IVF, maybe you're thinking about it,
Mm,
and we're not here to judge. I don't care if you've done it 20 times, never, we won't judge you. We're here to listen. We're here to help if we can. We're here to guide and steer you to the truth if we can. Like if you want to contact us, and talk about it or have questions
mm,
about it, you can do that. I'm sure you probably wouldn't want to leave a comment below, though you can. We have a link in our description section below. You can contact us directly. If Samantha gives me the permission, I'll put her email in the description
mhm.
section and you can contact her and just say, hey, I need help. Can I talk to you? And that's what we're
Yeah.
here for. We're not here to judge. I've sinned my own life. I've
Mm,
sinned enough for 50,000 people.
right.
Like if the God judges me, I'm dead. I'm going to hell. But He had mercy on me. He loved me through my sin. And we're just here to do that with everybody else as well.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Beautiful.
So thank you, Samantha, for joining us. I've loved this show. And I don't know if you could say that, but I think it's really important content. And I think you
Mm.
did a very good job of presenting it. So I'm appreciative of the fact that you came on our show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak on this subject. Obviously, it's one I'm very passionate about. I think that God has put it on my heart and it's blossomed in really fruitful ways. And so if I can help anybody through it, then I'm happy to do so. So thank you.
Yes, and for all of you out there, I just want to give a reminder that if you would like Samantha to come to your church and speak, or if you would like to check out her work, we're going to link all of that in the description section below. We're also going to link a lot of the topics, other videos, different things that we mentioned, especially the one on infertility. We'll link that in the description section below. And finally, if you want to follow us on social media, support our ministry monthly, one time, yearly, please see all of that in the description link below. And feel free to share this with everybody, because you might not need it, but there is a whole dying world that does. So thanks for joining us today, and God bless you.